Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and I'll freely admit this project was always on the radar when it came to this season of this show. And I'll also admit it's probably better we get it out of the way now before we delve deeper into underground hip-hop. Because there's always one, the indie project that doesn't just bring in a ton of critical acclaim, but becomes a surprise hit, and even nets a few fleeting singles on the Hot 100 on the strength and popularity of the artists and songs alone. And yet what caught me by surprise is that this wasn't two established legends teaming up either. At least they weren't considered that at the time. Yeah, full disclosure here, I am mostly familiar with the work of both Mos Def, now known as Yasin Bey, but we're calling him Mos Def for the sake of this review at that time, and Talib Kweli before this. And they both had some breakout verses before 1998. But I could have sworn they had more established bodies of work before this. But no, I was wrong in my assumptions. While Mos Def had verses with the Bush Babies and De La Soul and others within the Native Tongues camp, and Talib Kweli had multiple appearances on Doom, the debut project of Cincinnati hip-hop group Mood back in 1997, which hopefully at some point we should cover in the series, but neither artist had a full-length solo debut ready to go when they were both signed to Rawkus. In fact, what might be more notable in their history is Sound Bombing, an early compilation release in 1997 from Rawkus that brought the entire roster of the label together and might have given Mos Def and Talib Kweli the connections they needed. And that's also probably another project we should cover here, come to think of it. Now, anyway, given that they both postponed their individual albums to work together, with Talib bringing his producer friend High Tech, and Mos Def looping in Native Tongues affiliates like 88 Keys and The Beat Miners, that chemistry was way too good to squander. So much so that to this day, while the duo has teased a return, this is the only project that they would complete together, the only full-length one anyway. So let's get into the unlikely smash that might not have been the first introduction, but absolutely put them on the map in hip-hop. That's right folks, we're talking about Mos Def and Talib Kweli, our Black Star, and this is Resonators. So I'll be honest, I've had this album on rotation pretty consistently the past couple of weeks, ever since it won the Patreon polls to the surprise of pretty much no one. And the most immediate observation, it also became the most exasperating one for me. Cause yeah, the album is goddamn great. Damn near a hip-hop classic that was rightly canonized at the time and has held up incredibly well to this day. Hell, it's almost so straightforward and effective, you wonder why certain critical outlets didn't give it more acclaim at the time, but that might as well set the table for what Black Star was in 1998. A response. Indeed, more than the distinctly underground styles that took sweeping pot shots at the mainstream that you get from peers on Rawkus like Company Flow, but wouldn't really engage with the mainstream, it's hard to ignore just how much Black Star is framed as a direct and accessible retort to the era of empty flash that Puff was pushing in, deeply entrenched in black, New York-focused hip-hop culture. And let me stress, that's a tricky line to walk in the late 90s. The line that was being pushed by the industry establishment that lyricism, boom bap, conscious content, they were out. They weren't cool. So for Mos Def and Talib Kweli to deliver a project that respected hip-hop traditions while still sounding polished, forward-thinking, and deliberately avoiding sounding like a throwback, that's a tough sell. Now granted, if you look at the Native Tongues acts, it's not like that tradition had gone away, but gangster rap era in the mid-90s had sidelined a lot of that sound, especially in the mainstream, and there was a question how it would persist going into the late 90s and what Puff was pushing out. And yet, Mos Def and Talib Kweli found success reinforcing the conscious tradition that did actually reignite in the late 90s, kind of adjacent to the mainstream, mostly by just making a kick-ass hip-hop album that's layered and intelligent, but not impenetrable. Indeed, the fact that Black Star is so tuneful while relying on stripped-back beats, spare melodies, sinuous bass lines, and a genuine organic tone, it probably did most of the heavy lifting before factoring in the phenomenal chemistry and bars and melodies between Talib Kweli and Mos Def. What's more interesting here is that while there are samples and scratching, it doesn't lend the project a dusty or weathered tone that had come to represent a lot of the old school boom bap New York sound. Even today, this album sounds contemporary, as a project that could be released, because even with the songs shouting out b-boys and graph artists and how Children's Story interpolates Slick Rick, they're more old school callbacks rather than feeling ossified in the past. And yet, that New York City feel is unmistakable. Beyond the punchy boom bap, the scratching, and the samples that pepper the project as introduction and interludes, and some of the Spanish phrases opening up Respiration, there's still a warmth and crackle to the mix that feels burnished even off some of the darker or more warped minor tones that creep across Redefinition or Haters Players or Twice in a Lifetime. And even then, there's actually a balance of tone here, the tension coursing through the bass off the questioning guitar phrases on Astronomy, Eighth Light, and Respiration. Then you get the warm sensuality of the bass grooves on Brown Skin Lady and K.O.S. Determination, to the weary contemplation of Thieves in the Night. Even Children's Story, where Mos Def might sound a little bit out of pocket with the more of the old school flow, I still hold as a part of the album that I really like. Just at a brighter, less mature moment that is such a De La Soul move, and all the more appreciated for it in terms of balancing this project out. But you know what? That is just great production. As much as it plays in contrast to what was being pushed in 1998 in the mainstream, what might stand out all the more starkly is the lyricism and the content. And again, what's very telling is how, while the subject matter was common on native tongues projects, and that Talib Kweli and Mos Def, they weren't really reinventing the wheel, especially in the underground, where it's not like the subject matter had gone away, but the more accessible framing was intended purposefully for a larger audience. Company Flow, they didn't even really care to engage with a wider demographic outside of the rap nerds, and that was fine for them. But Black Star was aiming bigger, and that's what's telling as well. There's obviously some ego on display. It's never at the expense of the audience or the other MC in the group. You can make the argument that the content and flows between them are so evenly matched here that you can have active debates with who dominated every single song, with of course the big exception being Respiration with Common, where even if I think both MCs are close, Common's more gritty and emotive framing of Chicago, it feels way more earthy and heartfelt. He was on fire then, and it really shows on the song. And I also really dig the framing of how they presented their progressive thinking and politics on this album. Aspirational, but grounded and realistic of what would need to change and evolve for things to work. They weren't about to mince words about describing real hardships, physical, mental, or emotional. But the framing wasn't really nihilistic or crushing either. There were deaths and tragedies, but there was a chance to make this right going forward. It was kind of optimistic, both within hip-hop culture and for the black community at large. Take one of the most immediately recognizable tunes on the project, Brown Skin Lady, which right from the start juxtaposes the sample of the 1989 film Chameleon Street, a satire film that's set in Detroit, with this monologue showing societal conditioning reinforcing colorism, with then the rebuttal of the Gil Scott-Heron sample from the song We Almost Lost Detroit, with Mos Def and Talib Kweli delivering verses that are so joyous in their appreciation of dark-skinned women, which amazingly manages to skirt past any depreciation of other standards of beauty, something not even Kendrick Lamar was able to pull off on Humble. Now granted, this is the late 90s, and while questions of respectability politics were starting to take shape among parts of black academia, specifically black women, it's hard to ignore that there are still being seeds of that similar moralism on songs like K.O.S. Determination, where hustling is framed as spiritual emptiness and lacking self-determination to get out of the trap. But I reckon that neither MC was intending it to be seen like that, as both seem to have a lot of broad and specific skepticism of the system at large, likely speaking more to self-loathing and greed that perpetuates the easy buck in the trap, while slamming both the industry and the corrupt systems at large that perpetuate that. And while Children's Story is the easiest parable to grasp about selling out on the project, along with a couple easy shots taken at Puff's dilution of the culture both in strip mining the past and his manipulation of the music industry that doesn't reflect the reality of the streets, I mean, it's obvious, of course they do it. But the two pieces I liked the most was the interlude Yo Yeah, which ends with a sample from the poet Norman Jordan, who's showing black people talking about the flaws of their brothers while pointlessly adhering to a broken system. And then there's Thieves in the Night, where Talib Kweli openly questions a capitalistic structure in which black empowerment is defined and then shaped by white systems at the expense of their self-worth. And Mos Def goes even further, highlighting how there's no room for gradation within the black culture to allow humanity to thrive. They're either one way, they're either the very top or the very bottom. There's nothing in the middle. And even then, he questions how much of even his message is lived or just sincere enough for the stage, where they don't even own the masters behind them. Hell, a thought-provoking stuff. So much so that I've always questioned why the album ends with the posse cut Twice in a Lifetime, which can't quite have the same impact as Thieves in the Night does, which is one of my favorite songs here, especially when a healthy cross-section of the album is full of the same intricate wordplay and assertions of skill. You didn't really need the posse cut for the end. But while we're in this territory, look, for as much as I appreciate the viciousness of Hey to Playas and how Definition is a striking single in its own right, it's hard to ignore its Dark Mirror redefinition and Mos Def dropping the homophobic slurs, which might be reflective of the time, but sure as hell doesn't help any of that air of conscious enlightenment, especially when Mos Def has later expressed some of these same views off record later on. Not helped by how Punchline says he's gonna start a gay rumor about his adversary on Twice in a Lifetime. I mean, it's not even that good of a bar. And I do have a few other issues with the project too. A few tracks, especially near the back half of the album, can drag a little bit. I do think the sequencing could have helped to refine this just a little bit, especially with the final 3 songs, but these are minor quibbles overall. And really, if I'm looking for a hip-hop album that deserves the vast majority of the critical acclaim it has received at the time and for the most part holds up today, I would go for Mos Def and Talib Kweli are Black Star, launching the careers of conscious hip-hop stars, even cresting amidst the mainstream and arguably putting ruckus on the map. And while there are certain publications that were dismissive of the sound and album at the time, The Source unsurprisingly springs to mind, Mos Def and Talib Kweli are Black Star is truly an excellent album and it stands the test of time, netting a 9 out of 10 from me and the highest of recommendations. Folks, if you're looking for a gateway more into the late 90s underground scene, especially to raucous, while still sounding accessible and tuneful, there are a few projects that are better than this. So yeah, if you haven't heard it, absolutely take the time, check it out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm really happy I got to go through this album. I think it's really special. And hey, if you want to vote on what's coming up next on my schedule for Resonators, go to my Patreon. I'd be happy to see you over there. But if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious how you guys think this album holds up. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.